The world heard one phrase and instantly panicked. The Strait of Hormuz could be blocked. Oil traders froze. Shipping markets tensed up. News headlines started sounding like the global economy was one missile away from cardiac arrest. And for a moment, it felt like the world was watching the same disaster unfold in real time. A narrow stretch of water, a regional conflict, and the possibility that one of the most important energy arteries on Earth could suddenly shut down. But here's the twist nobody talks about enough. The real shock was not the blockade itself. It was how quickly the world reacted to the idea of one. Because when you look past the panic, past the headlines, and past the dramatic predictions of $100, $120, even $150 oil, a very different story starts to appear. A story about perception, leverage, market psychology, military deterrence, and a strategic choke point that may be powerful, precisely because it doesn't always need to be fully closed to shake the entire planet. And that is why the Hormuz Blockade story fooled almost everyone. To understand what happened, you first need to understand what the Strait of Hormuz actually is. This is not just another shipping lane. It is one of the most important energy choke points in the world. According to the U.S. Energy Information Administration, around 20 million barrels of oil per day moved through Hormuz in 2024, equal to about 20% of global petroleum liquids consumption. On top of that, roughly 20% of global LNG trade also passed through the same route, much of it from Qatar. So when people hear that Hormuz might be blocked, they don't hear a regional issue. They hear a global shock. They hear higher fuel prices, disrupted shipping, inflation pressure, supply chain pain, and another crisis spreading far beyond the Middle East. That fear is not irrational. But in recent tensions, what fooled the world was the gap between what was possible, what was threatened, and what was actually happening. So in this video, we're breaking down the real story. Why Hormuz matters so much, why the blockade narrative spread so fast, why the market reacted the way it did, and why the biggest weapon in Hormuz may not be an actual closure at all, but the credible threat of one. Let's start with the first big truth. Hormuz is valuable because it is narrow, critical, and hard to replace. The strait connects the Persian Gulf to the Gulf of Oman and the Arabian Sea. Major oil exporters in the Gulf rely on it to reach global markets. And while Saudi Arabia and the UAE do have some pipelines that can bypass the strait, the spare bypass capacity is limited. EIA estimates that only about 6 million barrels per day of pipeline capacity was available to reroute flows around Hormuz in the event of disruption. That sounds large until you compare it with the roughly 20 million barrels per day moving through the strait. In other words, the backup system exists, but it is nowhere near big enough to replace the main artery. That means the threat is real. A disruption in Hormuz would matter immediately. But now comes the second truth. The world often reacts to the worst-case scenario before the worst-case scenario actually happens. After regional escalation, markets rapidly began pricing in the fear of a major supply shock. Reuters reported that analysts at Goldman Sachs and Citi did not expect a major, sustained oil supply disruption as their base case, even though they acknowledged that a worst-case blockade scenario could send prices above $100 per barrel. That distinction matters. Markets were not reacting only to what had happened. They were reacting to what might happen if the conflict escalated further. And this is where the Hormuz story starts to fool people. Because in public conversation, the line between risk, threat, partial disruption, and full blockade gets blurred almost instantly. A shipping advisory becomes, the route is shutting down. A military warning becomes, global energy is cut off. Higher insurance costs become, oil supply has collapsed. And a geopolitical signal becomes a market fact before the facts are fully clear. Reuters reported that even after Israel's strikes on Iran in June 2025, commercial traffic was still continuing through the Strait of Hormuz. The U.S. Corps-led Combined Maritime Force said the strait remained open and that traffic continued to flow. Even as ship owners became more cautious and governments urged tighter reporting and security measures. That means the fear was real, the danger was real, but the apocalyptic version of the story was not yet the operational reality. So why does this happen every time Hormuz enters the headlines? Because Hormuz is not just a waterway. It is a psychological trigger in the global energy system. Traders know that even a temporary disruption can spike freight rates, raise insurance costs, delay cargoes, and rattle inflation expectations. Governments know that a Hormuz scare can expose how dependent entire regions still are on Gulf energy. Importers know that if this choke point is compromised, the countries hit first are not necessarily the loudest voices in the media, but the major Asian economies that depend heavily on those flows. According to the EIA, about 84% of crude oil and condensate moving through Hormuz in 2024 went to Asian markets, and about 83% of LNG moving through Hormuz also went to Asia. China, India, Japan, South Korea, and other Asian buyers are the ones most exposed to a disruption there. So the global fear around Hormuz is not abstract. It maps directly onto real energy dependence. Now here's the next layer of the deception. A full closure of Hormuz is frightening, but it is also extremely difficult to sustain. This is one of the most misunderstood parts of the story. People often talk about blocking Hormuz as if it is like closing a gate. It isn't. A blockade in this region would mean military escalation, risks of retaliation, possible naval intervention, and severe consequences not only for the countries being targeted, but also for the actor trying to shut the route down. Reuters' analysis in June 2025 argued that even if Iran disrupted Hormuz, the long-term damage might be less persistent than investors feared, because any attempt to block maritime traffic would likely trigger a rapid and forceful response from the U.S. Navy. The same analysis also noted a basic strategic contradiction. Iran itself would suffer from disrupting its own export lifeline. That point is crucial. The threat of blockade gives leverage. An actual prolonged blockade creates blowback. And that is why the Hormuz crisis often operates as a tool of pressure more than a permanent shutdown model. The power is in forcing markets to ask, what if? Because once markets ask that question, prices move, insurers react, shipping patterns change, and governments start contingency planning. In other words, Hormuz can shake the world without being fully closed. That is the trick. That is the strategic genius of the threat. And that is also how the world gets fooled, because what many people think they are reacting to is a closed strait. What they are often actually reacting to is a credible possibility of closure, amplified through energy markets, security warnings, and nonstop commentary. History supports this pattern too. Reuters pointed out that previous geopolitical oil shocks, from the Gulf crisis in 1990 to the Russia-Ukraine energy shock in 2022, produced dramatic price spikes that later reversed. Prices can surge violently when fear peaks, but the surge itself does not always prove that a long-term physical shortage is underway. Sometimes it proves something else, that markets hate uncertainty more than almost anything, and uncertainty is exactly what Hormuz produces better than almost any other choke point in the world. There's also an LNG angle here that many people miss. A lot of the public discussion focuses on crude oil, but LNG matters enormously too. In 2024, about 20% of global LNG trade transited Hormuz, primarily from Qatar, which exported around 3 billion cubic feet per day of LNG through the strait. That means a Hormuz crisis is not just an oil story. It is a gas story, a power generation story, a utility story, an industrial cost story, and for many Asian economies, a direct energy security story. So when the world panics over Hormuz, it is not panicking over one commodity. It is reacting to the possibility that multiple layers of the global energy system could be stressed at once. But even then, the facts matter. And the facts usually tell a more complicated story than the panic. Yes, Hormuz is critical. Yes, a disruption there would be serious. Yes, alternatives are limited. Yes, prices can spike on fear alone. But no, every headline about Hormuz does not automatically mean the global energy system has been severed. No, every threat equals a full operational blockade. And no, markets moving sharply upward do not always mean physical flows have fully stopped. That is the central lesson here. The Hormuz blockade story fooled the world because it exposed how quickly the modern information system collapses distinctions between signal and event, between threat and execution, between pricing fear and living through actual shortage. And once those distinctions disappear, panic becomes the product. The real battlefield is not only the sea lane, it is the narrative around the sea lane. Who controls the narrative controls expectations. Who controls expectations moves prices. Who moves prices influences diplomacy, and who influences diplomacy can gain leverage without firing the final shot. That is why Hormuz remains one of the most dangerous places on Earth, even when ships are still moving through it, because the world does not wait for closure. The world reacts to the shadow of closure. So, did the Hormuz blockade fool the entire world? In one sense, yes. It fooled the world into treating possibility as certainty. It fooled markets into pricing fear faster than facts. It fooled headlines into flattening a complex geopolitical chess match into a single dramatic phrase. And it reminded everyone that in the modern global economy, perception can be almost as powerful as disruption itself. But it also revealed something deeper. The Strait of Hormuz is still one of the clearest pressure points in the international system. Around a fifth of the world's oil consumption and about a fifth of global LNG trade pass through it, and there are only limited alternatives if something goes wrong. That means the threat will always matter. The fear will always matter. And every serious escalation in the region will continue to send a message far beyond the Middle East. So the next time you hear that Hormuz is about to close, don't just ask whether the strait is blocked. Ask what is actually happening on the water. Ask what is happening in the oil market. Ask who benefits from the fear. And ask whether the world is reacting to reality, or once again, reacting to the threat of reality. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and stay with us for more deep, clear, and fact-based analysis on the stories shaping the world.